everyone, today we're going to talk about the War of 1812, and this is during James Madison's presidency. So during this time period, we have a group of younger Republicans who had entered office, and they weren't against war like the older generations were. These were young, hot-headed men from the South and the West who were called the War Hawks. They were tired of hearing all about how their fathers had fought the British and whipped them single-handedly, and they were tired of the impressment of U.S. sailors, and they wanted to go to war with Britain. Other than the War Hawks, there were more causes of the War of 1812, such as the desire for more land, especially the land in Canada and Florida. There were economic problems in the West, and there are still problems with Native Americans in the Western Territory. Native Americans are refusing to give up their land to these white Americans who had felt like they had earned it after the Revolutionary War. In fact, the British were still supplying weapons to Native Americans, and Congress was convinced that the British people in Canada were buying scalps from Native Americans, which was making the problems worse. The last cause, and probably the most important cause, is the idea of national honor. Madison decides that because of all these things, that's enough and it's time for war. He and the other Republicans felt that the only way they could show the world that democracy is the best form of government and assert their rights as Americans is to fight back. So they go to war. The war doesn't last very long. It ends in 1814, and it is a stalemate. Both sides got tired of the war and decided to end it peacefully. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, actually, in 1814, and pretty much restored things back to exactly the way it was before the war. It was a small war compared to anything going on in Europe. The U.S. only lost 6,000 men. In fact, Americans who were happy that the war was over would brag that not 1 inch was lost or ceded. So it's kind of a stalemate, probably leaning more towards a loss, to be honest. The White House burns down. There's mentions of them saving Washington's portrait, for example. They didn't solve the impressment of sailors issue. So there's still issues after the war that we're going to talk about. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the war, but I am going to talk about the impact of the war, because if you're asked a question on the test, it's more likely going to be about the causes or the impact. Your question could be something like, evaluate the extent to which the War of 1812 changed American society, or perhaps it's a turning point or something. So the first impact is that it led to the Federalist Party slowly dying out. The Federalists are mostly from the New England region up in the north, and the Embargo Act was put in place. This was during Jefferson's presidency, and now the war is actually hurting their businesses even more because it relied on trade with Great Britain. So several Federalists met at something called the Hartford Convention to discuss specific demands that they wanted the government to meet, such as compensation for the trade that they lost, a new amendment that required 2/3 vote on any new embargoes that would potentially be passed, and they even wanted a law passed that said the president couldn't be from the same state twice in a row. This last one was because they were worried they were losing power to southern states like Virginia, who had had several presidents from this state now. These demands, however, came when the U.S. had just won a major victory in the Battle of New Orleans. So now, as they're making these demands and the U.S. just won this major battle, they look like super petty, and people began to think that the Federalists want secession or to break free from the United States. It makes the Federalist Party look really bad, and from here on out, they're unable to really challenge for the presidency. So impact number one is that the Federalist Party begins to die out. The biggest impact on the war was the increase of nationalism it brought to the United States. They began the war as a disjointed nation, but after it was much more unified. They had defeated something called the Barbary Pirates, which were a problem beginning in Jefferson's presidency. They rechartered the national bank, something that was helpful to American businesses in keeping the currency stable. They passed the first protective tariff in 1816, so instead of passing a tariff just for the purpose of raising money to pay debt, this time it was specifically passed to help protect American businesses from the cheap products that the British were now trying to sell in the United States. Nationalism was taken even a step further when Henry Clay, You remember this guy? He is the great compromiser. Well, he came up with something called the American system, something that would help create American markets. It had three main parts. It needed a strong banking system, which could provide lots of credit, a protective tariff like the one they just passed, and internal improvements like roads, canals, ways that they can transport all these new products. Clay felt that the American system would help create a more unified America and help businesses in both the North and the South. There were several court cases that came about after the War of 1812 that led to something called judicial nationalism. Chief Justice John Marshall, the guy we talked about in an earlier video in the ruling in Marbury versus Madison, that gave the Supreme Court the power of judicial review, is still in charge of the court, and he had several important rulings during this time period. The first is called McCulloch versus Maryland. This was when the state of Maryland tried to tax the National Bank because they wanted to destroy it. Marshall ruled that the bank was constitutional, using the same ideas that Hamilton used earlier about loose construction of the Constitution, and that Maryland was not allowed to tax the bank. This gives the federal government more power because now loose construction of the Constitution, the idea that it doesn't have to be specifically stated in the Constitution, it can just be implied that the government has the right to do something. This now becomes an official thing. So this gives the federal government more power. Another court case is Fletcher versus Peck. Georgia had created a contract for 35 million acres of land to private speculators, but the public hated it, so they tried to take it back and cancel the transaction. But the Supreme Court ruled that it was a binding contract, and they could not just go back on what they had agreed to. This is the first time the Supreme Court was able to declare state law unconstitutional. Again, this gives the Supreme Court more power over the states. And the last court case I want to talk about is Gibbons versus Ogden. This is called sometimes the steamboat case. The state of New York tried to give a monopoly to a specific steamboat company that carried goods between New York and New Jersey, but the Supreme Court ruled that New York had no right to grant a monopoly because only Congress could regulate trade that was between two states. This, again, gives more power to the federal government. So you can see that we have this increase in government's power during this time period, an increase in nationalism in the Supreme Court, in the people as well. So Americans began to call this time period after the War of 1812 the era of good feelings. When Monroe was elected president in 1816 as a Republican, the Federalists put forward a candidate for the last time, and he was crushed in the election. And in 1820, Monroe would actually run unopposed, which is pretty unique. Can you imagine that today if somebody runs for a presidential election and nobody's running against them? Monroe also led a tour around the United States to inspect the military defenses, and even people in New England who were typically Federalists were happy to see him. This idea that everything was great after the War of 1812 isn't entirely true, though. For example, in 1819, there was a financial panic. And in 1820, the issue of the Missouri Compromise was creating even more sectionalism. We're going to talk more about the specifics of this in a later video, but it does lead to more states, which is something that also boosts this idea of nationalism. There was also literary nationalism at the time, where Americans like Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper began to write about American scenes and themes. For example, James Fenimore Cooper wrote the book The Last of the Mohicans about the American efforts in the French and Indian War. Also, textbooks, which were once written by only British authors, were now being written by Americans, and even American painters began to paint American landscapes. And then after the War of 1812, the United States began to shift to isolationism, which means not getting involved in world affairs, and instead focused on more westward expansion. In 1819, Americans gained more land by acquiring Florida due to the Adams-Onis Treaty, and in 1823, Monroe, encouraged by his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, declared that the European powers need to stay away from any unclaimed land in the Western Hemisphere, so they would be able to claim it for themselves eventually, at least that's the idea, and to leave Latin American countries alone. They were worried that the monarchies would try to crush any form of democratic rule in these countries, but also they were concerned that they would be invaded if any of the European powers had more land closer to the young United States, who didn't exactly have the greatest military at the time. They knew they could declare this even without military strength because Britain, who needed to sell their goods in Latin America, would protect these countries with their own navy, though. So they kind of relied on that when passing the Monroe Doctrine. While the Monroe Doctrine was really just an empty threat on the part of the United States, it is a good example of this idea of nationalism during this time, where Americans felt proud enough to declare things like this. There are a lot of problems going on during this time period, such as sectionalism, which I'm going to get into in a different video. Today's practice question is from the 2022 exam, and it is: evaluate the extent to which the United States developed a national identity between 1800 and 1855. Pause the video, take some time to outline it, write a thesis, think about what your context would be, jot down some evidence, and then when you're done, check out the potential responses in the description below. Hope you guys have a great day, and because we talked about nationalism today and war, maybe you should take a little break, 15 minutes, okay? Don't watch the whole thing, and watch a little bit of Star Wars. Or maybe we should save that for imperialism later. I don't know. Either way, I hope you guys have a great day. Keep up the studying. I'm proud of the work you're doing. See you in class soon.